Livingston, and this evening we're going to be painting tulips. I'm going to show you a couple of ways to do them in watercolor. There are lots more, I'm sure, but anyway, these are two that I like to do. And for materials, you need to have watercolor paper. You need watercolor paint of some sort. If you're working from tube paint, then you would squeeze a little bit into, just a little bit into either the well of a small palette like that, or onto a plate, leaving spaces between. And if it's fresh out of the tube, you want to take some water on your brush and then pull it over a little bit into, make its own little puddle beside the original. The paint out of the tube is going to be way too thick to be able to be used like that, so you have to make it a little bit easier to work. If you're using paint that is dried in a palette, or you buy block paints, then you're going to, before you start, a few minutes before, you want to make sure that you put a couple of drops of water on the paint so that it dissolves a little bit and makes it easier. Brushes for this evening, I'm going to use two rounds, two different color sets, so that I don't have to worry about it totally bleeding together. So one for the green and one for the oranges of the flowers. And I also have a liner for detail, and I'm going to use watercolor pencils, a green for the leaves, and I used an orange to trace sort of the outline of the flowers. You don't have to do this, but if you do it, it just gives you kind of an outline and makes it easier to paint into. If you're using regular, like an HB pencil or something like that, you're going to get a line showing with it. Some people don't mind that. I don't particularly like it myself, but if you do it, whichever kind of pencil you're using, you want to make certain that you're working very light. You don't want gouge into the paper, because the paint will settle into that gouge and then it will make it a very dark line when you're done. For this one, I'm just basically going to paint, kind of paint by number. I'm going to paint into the flowers that I drew just before we started. And I'm going to use, I don't have an orange in this set of colors, so I'm just going to use red and yellow. And I'm just going to paint it right onto the page like this, just fill in the shades. You don't have to slavishly copy exactly the way the colors are on your tulips if you buy fresh tulips. And there's tons of visuals online you can use if you don't have access to any fresh ones. But I find it helps to sort of have the real thing there. I kind of like to do that. Now, as these open, the yellow becomes more and more apparent, so I'm going to put a little more yellow. Even though it sort of blends together, it gives you kind of a more, I don't know, organic feel to it. It just feels more like the original actually looks than if you just paint a solid blob. And that's what we're going to do next time, on the second time. Because those are so wet, I'm going to leave them for a little bit, and I'm going to move to a different one. I'll show you the second way to do the blossoms. And this time I'm going to work, that one was horizontal. We would call that a landscape view. This is a portrait view, up and down, narrower. And I'm going to take just part of the blooms. I'm not going to do the whole thing. I'm going to enlarge them again so that they're kind of closer. And I'm just going to paint with water to start with. I'm just going to paint the shape I want with water. And now I'm going to encourage you to try and do this without actually painting the whole thing. Just drop in the water, the paint into the water like this, and let it do its own little movement on it. It's kind of a cool way to paint. And you really get a feel for the tensile strength of the water, how it sits and it creates that border around it. So I'm going to do another one here. just kind of see the bit of color there. And the other thing you can do, once you've got it, you can't lift it a lot because the water will drip, but as long as you move it just gently, you can see you can move it around a little bit. It's kind of a fun thing to do as well, just to explore a little bit. Did was I mixed, because I don't have other greens, I mixed some yellow into the green that I have, and I made a kind of light lime green tone for the stems. They tend to be a little lighter than the leaves. I'll paint them in first this time. So I've gone back to the original one that I pre-drew, and I'm going to just start painting in the leaves to do that. In the shapes that I put in. And this is one where if it winds up at the end where it's too pale, you can just layer in another coat of the green to make it darker, depending on the effect you want at the end. Some of the stems. Now for this I added yellow to green to make the stem a little bit lighter color. So I'm using the liner for that. If you don't have a liner, you can use a regular brush, but you're going to have to use just the very tip. Aside for a couple of minutes to dry, and then we'll decide on a background for it after. I'm going to show you a couple of prints of paintings I've done before. Watercolor itself is transparent. It has a clearness to it. You can sort of see through it. It's not that you can't paint it dark enough to be opaque, but it basically doesn't have to be. If you use something like gouache or tempera, which are totally opaque colors, then you get a different feel. So compare this to, say, one like that, where you get a completely different feeling from the painting. In this one, it's made with, I used gouache on it, and then I did a lifting out to create the shape of the petals. So when you lift out color and then you maybe add in a lighter one, it just makes it a little not so solid a looking bloom. In this one, I left it white around the shapes of the petal, the individual petals, just to highlight that. This wasn't a painting I was thrilled about, but I wound up cutting it up actually into a series of cards. So this is a print of the original, and then what I did was I cut it into sort of like thirds, and it was much more interesting that way because the shapes were kind of unusual. They weren't all nice and balanced, and even some small, some large. It's nice to have that variety of shapes on your page. And it's nice also to have a reflection of color. So the colors that you have kind of at the top should also mirror to some extent at the bottom. It just makes it a more kind of nice feeling to the painting. This was one where I got very close to the flowers and tried to get the feel of how they looked really close up. And in fact, I used purple on it, but that was those tulips were almost black. They were just astounding. Anyway, so this is a print of what it looked like initially, and then I made a background on it, which I'm going to show you how to do shortly, in a different way, just to add a different kind of texture because you don't want it all exactly the same. And this system of texture I used on this one to do the actual painting, and then afterwards I did put it in after kind of similarly, just blotted in the blue so that it was not exactly the same but kind of different. So this is a fun technique to use in your paint. Here's the one that you can sort of see the difference. I don't know how well you can tell, but when I did this painting, it was all with watercolor, and it was lovely, and transparent and so on. But I tried to paint one coming towards me, and I didn't like how it looked. So I took some gouache paint and I painted little bulbs over top of it. And it sort of rescued the picture to some extent, except when you look at it, you can tell these are very solid and these are not solid. These are transparent. So you really see a difference between the two types of paint. Okay, so I'm going to show you that system of how you make that nice texture. And I started it earlier on this one. I'm going to work a little bit on that. So with this texture, I'm going to use a blue watercolor pencil. That's the green one. Blue. And a piece of sandpaper. So what I do is, unlike with a wash where you have to do it all kind of at the same time, this is kind of neat to fill in sections where there's no possible way you could put a wash in this afterwards without destroying the entire picture. I'm painting just with water, small sections in between. And then I'm going to use the sandpaper and I'm going to run it across the bottom of the lead of the watercolor pencil. And that's how you make that texture. It's just kind of neat. And it doesn't matter if the drops fall on the flowers because you just can brush them off or blow them off after. So I'm going to fill in this one that way. Do this nice big section first. And because of the nature of the look of this, it doesn't have to all be done at one time. You can do it like this where part dried and part didn't. It doesn't really matter. It just gives you a different feel. Using my blue. It also goes fast, which is nice. What I'm going to add, I'm going to add some of that green. picture down. Now this one, I'm going to try a different way of finishing it. I'm going to draw some geometrics. This is all rounded kind of. I'm going to make just some geometric shapes. And paint in different colors. Now this is using wet paint onto the dry paper, unlike with the wash where you're painting into wet. And I'm painting it up and down because the other things are kind of, this is a cross, so I'm going to contrast it. Make it come to there. Okay, so we have three different possible finishes to the pictures. Having taken the tape off, this is the one, this is how this one looks with the speckled background. I really like that one. You can leave it plain without any background at all, and it's fine. And then this one, I added an extra layer of color, and I like it better than I did before. So just three different ways that you can try it. There are more, but for today, that was it. So the next lesson will be in a couple of weeks, and it'll be a misty lake, how you make a reflection of a lake with trees, and we'll see you then. Hopefully, hope you enjoyed today.